Silas Thorne was fired 2 days before the first hard frost of 1892. The sky over the Lazy J Ranch was a bruised purple, heavy with the weight of unshaded snow. The foreman, a man with a heart like a sundried leather strap, didn't even look Silas in the eye. His offense was simple yet unforgivable to men who valued cattle above family. He refused to abandon his 10-month-old daughter, Lily. The foreman had no use for a cowboy carrying baggage. A cowboy can't chase strays with a crying babe on his saddle. The man had spat, his breath hitching in the cold air. Silas didn't argue. He was a man who saved his words for things that mattered, and the foreman wasn't one of them. He packed his meager belongings into a single burlap sack. He checked the cinch on his saddle one last time, though he knew he wouldn't be riding far. His horse had been reclaimed by the ranch, leaving him with nothing but his boots and his grit. He walked away from the bunkhouse without looking back. He had 2 copper pennies in his pocket, and a hole in his left glove that let the biting wind in. He had walked for 2 days across ground hardened by the coming frost. The vast Wyoming prairie felt like an ocean of frozen grass stretching toward a horizon that offered no mercy. The sun hung low over the plains like a heavy gold coin, offering light but no warmth. The wind carried the sharp, dry scent of sagebrush and the metallic bite of coming snow. Lily was a tiny spark of life cradled in his aching arms. She was sleeping against his rough linen shirt tucked deep inside his sheepskin coat. Her rhythmic breathing and the tiny puff of heat from her lungs were the only things keeping him moving. By the time he reached the gate of the Blue Willow Ranch, his boots were thinned as parchment. Every step was a battle against the numbness creeping up his legs. The gate was a massive structure, built from heavy cedar, reinforced with rusted iron. Beyond it, the Blue Willow looked like a fortress of peace in a harsh gray world. It was one of the largest surviving ranches outside Laram, legendary and imposing. Sarah Sterling was wealthy in land and cattle, but dangerously poor in ready cash. One missed payment could cost her everything. Silas stopped for a moment, adjusting his sweat-stained hat to hide his tired, bloodshot eyes. He didn't want to look like a beggar or a broken man. He wanted to look like a man who could still pull his weight. Dry leaves and loose grits skittered around his boots as he walked the long dirt path towards the main house. The house was a 2-story structure of white timber and stone, standing tall against the wind. A woman stood on the porch, watching his slow approach. She was leaning against a sturdy support beam, dressed in a gown of deep indigo blue. The color was striking against the stark, colorless landscape. Her hair was as dark as a raven's wing, pulled back in a practical but elegant knot. This was Sarah Sterling. The locals in town called her the Ironed Widow. They whispered that she was made of cold steel and mountain ice. They didn't mention the reason for the ice. Her husband and young son had both died during the Great Blizzard of 1888. The storm had taken everything she loved in a single white night. Since then, she had run the ranch alone, a woman in a man's world. She allowed no one close enough to hurt her again. She watched Silas approach with a cool, measuring gaze that seemed to see right through his coat. Silas stopped at the base of the wooden steps and tipped his hat with a trembling hand. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "My name is Silas Thorne. I'm looking for work." His voice sounded like gravel rubbing together after miles of silence. "I can mend fences, break horses, and do the work of 3 men. Sarah didn't look at his hands first, though they were calloused and strong. She looked at the bundle he held so protectively against his chest. She saw the tiny tufted blanket and the curve of a small head. "I don't need another ranch hand, Miss Sithorn," she said. Her voice was smoother than he expected, like silk over a blade. Silas felt his heart sink like a lead weight in his chest. He thought of the 2 pennies and the long cold road back to Laramie. He began to turn away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the world. Then Sarah stepped closer to the railing, her eyes softening just a fraction. "I don't need a hand," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his. "I need a husband." Silas froze in his tracks. He thought the howling wind was finally playing tricks on his mind. "Mom?" he asked, turning back slowly. Sarah's expression hardened, the business like mask returning to her face. "My late husband's brother, Edgar, is a greedy man," she explained. "He bought the ranch's overdue mortgage note from a bank back east. He's been waiting for me to fail. The mortgage agreement contains an old partnership clause for my father's time. If I remain the sole operator, when the note comes due on January 1st, Edgar can demand full payment. He knows I don't have the cash on hand. He can force a foreclosure and take everything. He plans to take the Blue Willow and sell the land to the railroad for a fortune. Unless I am married with a legal partner on the ranch, the bank must honor the original payment schedule. Edgar loses his leverage, and the ranch stays mine." Silas looked at the vast golden horizon of the ranch. He had heard of Sarah Sterling before, even at the Lazy J. Everyone near Laram knew the story of the Iron Widow who refused to break. "You'd marry a stranger just to keep your dirt?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Sarah looked out over the grass her father had bled for, her eyes flashing with fire. "It's not just dirt, Silas. It's a legacy. It's the only thing I have left. And I see a man who would do anything for his daughter. A man who walks miles through the cold with a child is a man I can trust. You give me the protection of your name and your presence. In return, I give you and that baby a home, a future, and a warm bed." Silas looked down at Lily's pale, sleeping cheeks. He thought of the wolves he had heard howling on the prairie the night before. He thought of the hunger that would soon wake her. "I'll do it," he said. Sarah studied him for a long moment, as though searching for any trace of dishonesty in his face. Then she stepped down from the porch and opened the heavy front door. "Before you promise yourself to this place," she said, "you should know what you are agreeing to protect." She led him through a wide kitchen, warmed by a cast iron stove. Copper pans hung above a scarred wooden table. The house was clean and orderly, but it carried the silence of rooms that had forgotten laughter. At the end of the hallway, Sarah stopped before a narrow door. Unlike the others, it was locked. Her fingers rested on the brass key hanging beside her locket. For several seconds, she did not move. Then she unlocked the door. The room beyond was small. A child's quilt covered the bed. A pair of tiny boots waited beneath the chair. On the windowsill stood a wooden horse with one crooked leg. Silas looked at the toy, but said nothing. "My son carved it with his father," Sarah whispered. "He was 7. Her voice remained steady, but her hand tightened around the key. "The storm took them both before I could reach the schoolhouse." Lily stirred inside Silas's coat. Sarah looked at the sleeping child, and something fragile passed across her face. "I have kept this room exactly as it was," she said. "I told myself it was loyalty." She closed the door gently. But perhaps it was only fear. Silas understood then that Sarah was not asking for a husband because she had stopped believing in love. She was asking because she had already survived losing it once. "I won't ask you to forget them," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him in surprise. "I only ask that you give Lily and me a chance to earn our place here." For the first time, the Iron Widow's gaze held no steel, only grief and the smallest beginning of trust. The agreement was a silent pact made under a violet, unforgiving sky. The following morning, Sarah drove them into Laram in a sturdy buck wagon. The air was crisp and sharp, smelling of impending snow and wood smoke. A justice of the peace married them in a narrow, cramped office behind the courthouse. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes and smelled of old ink and tobacco. There were no flowers, no music, and no promises of eternal love. Silas held Lily in his left arm while signing the legal register with his right. When the justice finally called them husband and wife, Sarah's hand trembled inside his. It was a brief electric moment, the first time they had ever touched. By noon, the Iron Widow had a husband, and the fired single father finally had somewhere to belong. They drove back to the ranch in a heavy, contemplative silence. That evening, Sarah placed 3 bowls on the kitchen table before remembering that Lily could not yet sit in a chair. She stared at the 3rd bowl for a moment, embarrassed by the mistake. Silas pretended not to notice. He remained standing beside the doorway, his hat held awkwardly against his chest. Sarah looked up from the stew. "Are you waiting for an invitation?" "I wasn't sure where you wanted me," Silas admitted. "You are my husband now," she said. The word sounded formal in her mouth, almost like something read from a legal document. "Sit." Silas lowered himself into the chair across from her. The stew smelled of beef, barley, and onions. It was the richest meal he had seen in months. He took 1 spoonful, then stopped. Sarah noticed. "Is something wrong with it?" "No, ma'am, Sarah," she corrected. Silas looked at the food. "I was thinking how long it has been since I ate at a real table." Before Sarah could respond, Lily began to fuss inside the basket beside his chair. Silas immediately set down his spoon, but Sarah reached the baby first. She lifted Lily carefully, tested the bottle against her wrist, and settled into the rocking chair near the stove. Lily quieted almost at once. Silas watched Sarah's expression change as the child drank. The hard lines around her mouth softened. "You have done this before," he said. Sarah's eyes remained on Lily. "A lifetime ago." The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and Lily's small, contented sounds. Silas looked down at his bowl. He did not want Sarah to see the emotion gathering in his eyes. For 2 days, he had imagined only shelter and milk. He had not allowed himself to imagine this. A table, a fire, a woman holding his daughter as though she mattered. Sarah glanced toward him. "Eat before it gets cold, Silas." He picked up his spoon. "Yes, Sarah." It was the first meal they shared as husband and wife. Neither of them spoke about love, but for a few quiet minutes, the house no longer felt empty. When supper was over, Silas quietly gathered the bowls without being asked. Sarah looked up in surprise. "You don't have to do that," she said. Silas carried the dishes toward the wash basin. "My mother used to say, a man who eats at a table ought to help leave it clean." Sarah watched him rinse each bowl with slow, careful hands. There was no pride in the gesture, no performance, only habit. Lily laughed from her basket as Silas made a funny face at her. For the first time in years, the kitchen echoed with something that sounded dangerously close to ordinary family life. Sarah found herself smiling before she realized it. The smile disappeared almost as quickly as it came. She had promised herself she would never grow comfortable again. The last time she had allowed herself to feel safe, life had taken everything from her. Silas Thorne was no longer a drifter. He was a man with a stake in the land. The first few weeks were a strange, careful dance of shadows. They lived in the same house, but felt miles apart. Silas slept in a small, sparse room off the kitchen. The sheets were clean and smelled of lye and summer sunshine. He worked from the first light of dawn until the stars appeared in the black sky. He fixed every sagging gate and reinforced the barn for the winter gales. He stacked cords of pine and cedar until they reached the eaves of the porch. He worked until his muscles screamed, proving his worth every single day. Yet, it was not the large repairs that Sarah noticed most. It was the small ones. The loose hinge on the pantry door stopped squeaking. The kitchen window, that had rattled for 4 winters, suddenly closed tight against the wind. The broken step beside the back porch was replaced before she could warn him about it. One morning, Sarah found her old rocking chair beside the hearth. A split runner had kept it in the storage room for years. Now the wood had been repaired, sanded smooth, and rubbed with linseed oil. She ran her fingers over the place where the crack had been. Silas entered carrying an armful of firewood. "You fixed this?" she asked. He shrugged as if it were nothing. It seemed a shame to let a good chair go unused. "It belonged to my mother." Silas stopped. "If I had known, I would have asked first." Sarah looked at the careful join beneath the runner. "No," she said softly. "You did right." That afternoon, she saw him in the barn rebuilding a nesting box for the hens. Lily was wrapped against his chest in a sling while he worked. Every few minutes, he stopped hammering to check that she was warm. He spoke to the baby in a low voice, explaining each task as though she were old enough to understand. "This board has to sit straight," he told her. "Anything worth building needs a solid beginning." Sarah remained unseen in the doorway. She thought of the men who had worked for her over the years. Most had waited to be told what to do. Silas noticed what was broken before she spoke. He repaired things without expecting praise. And with each repaired hinge, each tightened latch, and each quiet act of care, the blue willow began to feel less like a monument to what Sarah had lost. It began to feel like a home. Someone was helping her build again. One afternoon, Sarah walked into the tack room looking for a length of rope. She found Silas instead. He was repairing an old saddle that had belonged to her late husband. The leather was cracked with age, but he worked patiently, rubbing oil into every worn strap. "You don't have to fix that," Sarah said quietly. Silas looked up. "I know." "Then why?" He smiled faintly. "Because somebody loved it once." Sarah stood silent. She had almost forgotten that grief could be honored without being preserved exactly as it had been. When Silas finished, he placed the saddle back on its rack without another word. He had repaired it, not erased its history. While Silas worked across the ranch, Sarah brought warmth back into the house and slowly became the mother Lily needed. She fed the baby warm milk and sang songs in a voice that hadn't been used for music in years. Silas would often stop near the window, listening to the low hum of her voice. One evening, Lily woke up crying in her cradle near the hearth. The sound was sharp and distressed. Before Silas could even cross the room or set down his coat, Sarah was there. She had already lifted Lily into her arms with a practiced maternal grace. The baby pressed her warm face against Sarah's neck, seeking comfort. Lily made a soft babbling sound that was almost a word. "Ma." Sarah froze in the orange glow of the firelight. She held Lily tighter, her knuckles turning white. Tears began to slip silently down her cheeks, glistening in the light. The thick ice in her heart was beginning to crack and melt. Silas watched from the shadows of the doorway, his own heart aching with a new kind of hope. The child had found a home in Sarah's heart, and Silas began to wonder whether there might someday be room for him too. Later that night, long after Silas had carried Lily to her cradle, Sarah stood alone in the hallway. The brass key felt cold inside her palm. She had not opened her son's room since the day she showed it to Silas. Now she placed the key in the lock. Moonlight entered through the narrow window and touched the small bed, the faded quilt, and the wooden horse with the crooked leg. Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress. For 4 years, she had come into this room only to dust. She had never allowed herself to sit, never allowed herself to remember. The weight of her son's head against her shoulder, but Lily's almost words still echoed in her heart. "My." Sarah picked up the wooden horse. "I don't know if it is wrong," she whispered into the quiet room. "I don't know if loving her means I am leaving you behind." Her voice broke. "She makes the house sound alive again." A floorboard creaked behind her. Silas stood in the doorway holding Lily's blanket. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude." Sarah wiped her cheeks, but she did not ask him to leave. Silas stepped inside and placed the blanket beside her. "You aren't replacing him," he said. Sarah looked down at the wooden horse. How can you be certain? Because Lily didn't replace her mother in my heart. His voice grew rough. She simply gave me another reason to keep living. Sarah looked at him then. It was the first time he had spoken of Lily's mother. Do you still love her? Every day, Silas answered. And I still have room to care for the people standing in front of me. Sarah's eyes filled again. Silas sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. They remained there without speaking, two people surrounded by the memories of those they had buried. Neither tried to erase the other's grief. They simply shared its weight. Before leaving, Sarah placed the wooden horse on the lower shelf, where Lily might one day reach it. It was the first thing in the room she had moved in 4 years. If this story of a father's sacrifice and a widow's second chance has touched your heart, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Would you have trusted the stranger the way Sarah did? But the town of Laram was not kind to those who broke the mold. Gossip spread like a grass fire through the aisles of the general store. The widow bought herself a husband, the townspeople whispered behind their hands. She found a common drifter to save her gold and her pride. Silas heard the whispers when he went for supplies. But he kept his head down. He only cared about the warmth in Lily's belly and the safety of the ranch. However, Edgar Sterling was not a man who could be easily ignored. Edgar believed the ranch should have passed to him after his brother's death in the blizzard. He had spent 4 long years convincing himself that Sarah had stolen his rightful inheritance. One afternoon, he rode out to the ranch on a tall, expensive bay mare. He wore silk gloves and a long coat, but his heart was made of mountain ice. He found Silas splitting pine logs in the yard, the axe rhythmically rising and falling. You think a piece of paper makes you a Sterling? Edgar sneered from his saddle. Silas didn't stop swinging the heavy axe. The wood split with a satisfying loud crack that echoed off the barn. The paper says she's my wife, Silas said, his voice level and cold, and the law says I'm the partner she needs to keep this land. Edgar laughed, a dry and rattling sound like dead leaves. We'll see how long you last when the mercury drops and the real winter hits. A man with a brat is a man with a weakness I can exploit. Silas stopped then, his grip tightening on the axe handle. Touch my daughter, and you won't live to see the spring, Silas warned. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble of thunder. Edgar spat on the frozen ground and rode away in a cloud of dust and spite. That night, the temperature plummeted as a massive cold front moved in. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the heavy window panes in their frames. The thermometer on the porch had fallen well below 0 within an hour. Lily woke in the middle of the night, gasping for air in short, jagged bursts. It wasn't a normal cry of hunger or a wet diaper. It was a terrifying hollow rattle that seemed to come from her very soul. Silas and Sarah rushed to the cradle at the same time. The baby's face was flushed with a dangerous bright heat. Her throat is closing, Sarah whispered, her face turning deathly pale. She has the group, or worse, she needs a doctor. They held Lily upright beside a steaming kettle on the stove. They tried to moisten her parched lips with warm water. But the fever wouldn't break, and her breathing grew more labored. The path to town is blocked with fresh drifts, Sarah cried, looking at the white darkness outside. No horse can make it through this wind and ice. I'll walk, Silas said, his voice firm and final. He was already wrapping his boots in extra layers of burlap and twine. Youdieotr Silas. The gold will take your lungs before you reach the creek. Silas didn't listen to the logic of fear. He was a man driven by a singular desperate purpose. Sarah ran to her bedroom and returned with a small, locked wooden box. She pressed her grandmother's diamond earrings and a ruby brooch into his hand. Take these, she sobbed, her voice breaking. Find someone in town with a heavy sleigh and strong horses. Pay them anything. Give them the ranch if you have to. Just get the doctor back here before dawn. A life is worth more than stone Silas. Save our daughter." Silas disappeared into the blinding white wall of the storm. The cold was a living animal with iron teeth. It bit into his skin and pierced his eyes like needles. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face, so he followed the fence line. He used the frozen wire as a guide, his fingers going numb within minutes. He stumbled over buried logs and crawled through deep, suffocating drifts. He pictured Sarah rocking Lily by the dying fire. He pictured Lily's toothless smile and the way she grabbed his thumb. Hours passed in a blur of white pain and frozen lungs. He reached the outskirts of Laram as a ghost of ice and frozen breath. He collapsed against the doctor's front door with his full, staggering weight. When the door finally opened, Silas held out the jewels in a hand that couldn't feel them. "The blue willow, my daughter," he wheezed. His lungs felt like they were filled with shards of broken glass. The doctor knew Sarah Sterling well. He knew she would never part with those family jewels unless the world was ending. The doctor was a good man. He took the jewels, but vowed to keep them safe. He hitched his strongest Percheron horses to a heavy iron Shaw sled. They fought their way back through the screaming wind, the horses' breath turning to ice. They reached the ranch while the night was still black and a storm still raged around the house. The doctor worked through the night, keeping Lily upright in the steam of the kitchen. As the sun rose over a frozen, silent world, the rattle in her chest finally stopped. Lily took a deep, clear breath and fell into a natural healing sleep. The fever had broken, leaving her pale but safe. Silas sat on the floor by the stove, his feet frostbitten and blue. Sarah went to him and wrapped her arms around him, weeping with relief. Her tears carried the grief of the son she had lost and the terror of nearly losing this new family. Lily was no longer only Silas's daughter. Somewhere in that long, dark winter, she had become Sarah's child too. The following morning, Lily reached for Sarah the moment she woke. Silas pretended not to notice. He simply smiled to himself as he stirred oatmeal over the stove. Sarah carried the little girl across the kitchen while sunlight spilled through the frosted window. "You've spoiled her," Silas teased. Sarah laughed softly. "I believe she's done the same to me." For a brief moment no one spoke. The fire crackled. A kettle began to whistle. Outside, the wind still searched the prairie. Inside, winter no longer ruled the house. Silas realized he could no longer remember when this place had stopped feeling borrowed. It simply felt like home. The winter continued its long, cold march, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. There was no more distance, no more coldness between the husband and wife. Sarah spent every evening rubbing Silas's healing feet with herbal salve. "You were a brave fool to walk into that storm," she would whisper. "I told you I'd do anything for her," Silas replied, his voice soft. "And I would do the same for you, Sarah. When you walked into that white darkness," Sarah whispered one night by the fire, "I realized I wasn't afraid of losing the ranch anymore." "What were you afraid of losing?" Silas asked, taking her hand. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "You." Silas touched her cheek with the same gentleness he used for Lily. "This stopped being a bargain for me a long time ago," he confessed. In the weeks that followed, affection replaced their initial caution. Their shared meals grew longer, and their silences grew warmer. Their marriage became real in every way that mattered to the heart. They kissed for the first time in the quiet of the kitchen, and neither of them pretended the marriage was only a bargain anymore. But Edgar Sterling was a vulture waiting for the herd to weaken. Through December and January, Edgar attacked them with legal notices and threats. He sent inspectors and deputies, trying to find any flaw in their claim, but every attempt to reclaim the land through the bank failed, because of their marriage. By February, with his money gone and his forged documents beginning to unravel, he abandoned the law. He turned to the desperate cowardice of fire. The winter had tightened its grip on Wyoming. Outside, the world was buried in snow. Inside the barn, the stored hay had become dangerously dry. Cattle were dying across the state from the relentless deep freeze. Edgar gathered a group of desperate paid men and rode to the Blue Willow at night. The thick snow muffled their horses' hooves as they approached the back of the property. Silas was in the barn checking on the pregnant cows in the middle of the night. Suddenly, a torch sailed through the darkness and struck the dry haft. The hay ignited like gunpowder, sending flames roaring toward the rafters. "Leave him to burn," Edgar shouted from the shadows of the trees. "By morning, there'll be nothing left for her to claim." Silas fought the flames with a bucket, but a charred beam cracked and fell. It pinned his leg to the dirt floor, trapping him as the smoke rose. He groaned in pain as the smoke became a thick black curtain of death. Suddenly, a rifle shot rang out through the cold night air. Sarah was standing on the porch, steps like a lioness guarding her den. She held the Winchester steady against her shoulder, her eyes cold as flint. "Get off my land," she screamed, her voice carrying over the crackle of fire. She fired a warning shot into the frozen ground, several yards ahead of Edgar's horse. The animal reared in terror, throwing Edgar hard into the crusted snow. The other men were bullies and drunks, not soldiers or fighters. They saw Sarah's lethal resolve and fled back into the darkness. Sarah didn't wait to see if they returned. She tied a wet wool cloth around her face and ran into the burning barn. She found Silas struggling under the weight of the heavy timber. One end of the beam had landed against a solid feed trough. Sarah jammed heavy pitchfork beneath the edge and used the trough as a fulcrum. She strained until her muscles screamed and her lungs burned from the heat. The beam moved just enough for Silas to crawl free from the trap. They stumbled out into the cold air just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The barn was a total loss, but Silas was alive. They sat in the snow, holding each other tight as the fire turned to embers. Within days, the sheriff's deputies found the truth. They discovered forged notices and altered mortgage papers in Edgar's cellar.